let's now move on to another section. So in the past episodes, we have been discussing on different misconceptions this unknown author has put on this website called evilbible.com, and there is a specific article which talks about sexism in Torah. So what we have been doing, my friend Sharon and I, we have been doing is taking those misconceptions and discussing through them and clarifying, or rather refuting, why those misconceptions are wrong. In the past episodes, we looked into the misconceptions against the punishment given to women, or Eve, and then we discussed about two different families, Lot's family and the events that surrounded that family and the bad decisions that were made. And then we also discussed about Judah and his daughter-in-law, again some bad decisions made, and we discussed all these in the past episodes. So now let's discuss a few questions. I would rather say not questions, accusations or wrong conclusions the author comes to with respect to sexism in slavery. Torah and the slavery seems to be a very interesting and famous topic for a lot of them. So let's move on to discuss a few misconceptions that say Torah or the Bible promotes slavery, specifically Exodus chapter 21, which in fact has a heading, Laws About Slaves. So
that's right.
For the author, Exodus 21 verse 3 to 4 says that if a male slave is given a wife by his master, regardless of how long they are wed, how much they love each other, or if they have kids, he cannot leave servanthood with his wife or children. The women and children are merely property of the master, and their personal happiness or sanctity of the family doesn't matter. So this is something that's concerning our unknown author now.
Yes. So before we delve into the exact passage and try to see what she's trying to say, the author, we should understand slavery in the ancient world. We know that slavery was rampant in the ancient world, and many people have this misconception that Bible somehow is responsible for slavery. But the opposite is in fact true, because we know that the Israelites, the main characters in the Torah of the Bible, are the people of Israel. They were slaves in Egypt for more than 400 years. So slavery was already existent, and in fact Israelites were slaves. So we know that in no way Bible is responsible for bringing in slavery into the ancient culture. In fact, the contrary is true. In a time when slavery was rampant and slaves were mistreated, not at all valued, treated like animals or even worse than animals, and more slaves would die of bodily harm or hunger. And no one even cared for them. No one knew about them. They were worse than animals in that culture, in every culture of that time. But when we come to the Bible or to the Torah in Exodus 21, when God opens up giving laws about various things to the Israelites at Sinai, he starts off by saying, here are the laws regarding slaves.
Right.
That itself is a glorious, it's absolutely glorious that God is concerned about slaves whom no one is concerned about. And now God is giving some rules, some regulations, so that even slaves would have a dignified life, that their status would be elevated. So the Torah does acknowledge or knows that slavery is existent, and some kind of slavery would also be among Israelites, but this would be a death knell to the actual kind of slavery that was rampant. Rather, slavery in Israel would be distinct. It would be a rural, domestic work. It would be a small-scale one. So, going forward, this would kind of abolish the kind of slavery that existed around, and rather give dignity to slaves and elevate them to a position or to a kind of life that they never had. So this is very interesting, that the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, is so concerned about slaves and is now going to give some new rules, some new regulations on how masters should treat slaves and what their rights could be.
Right. In fact, the whole story of Bible is the story of redemption from slavery to freedom. Be it for Israel in 400 years of bondage in Egypt, to their journey to the promised land, or to the mankind in general who became slaves
That's
to
right.
sin after the
That's
fall,
right.
and the greatest redemption act of God, sending his own son to redeem his people from darkness to marvelous
That's right.
light, as Colossians chapter 1 mentions, right? So God
Yes.
is always in the business of redeeming people and not the other way around. If you carefully read through the
Not at all.
history of
Yes.
mankind, in fact, some of the greatest reformers like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson
Yes.
Mandela, etc., they quote Bible as their inspiration in their efforts towards abolition of slavery.
That's right.
I was reading an article the other day about Dr. King. In his final speech, which is titled "I've Been to the Mountaintop," Dr. King compared himself to Moses, who saw the land God had promised the Israelites, but knew he wouldn't enter it. So, if he actually
Right.
dig deep, these reference to Numbers chapter 27, verse 12, and Deuteronomy 34. The
Right.
same Torah, which is
That's
now
right.
referred as promoting slavery, is actually an
Yes.
inspiration to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.,
Luther.
who is a champion
That's
of,
right.
for abolishing slavery in the West. Let's talk about our own, even our own, our father of a nation, Mahatma Gandhi. His famous line, show your other cheek. Where do you think that originated from? It's quoted from Matthew 5:39. So Bible in general, talking about the 66 books, they have been instrumental in inspiring great leaders to fight against slavery and oppression. And
That's right.
and since we're discussing about slavery, I would like to clarify something here, Shirin.
Yes.
According to Torah, there were four basic ways Hebrew
Basic.
might become a slave to another Hebrew, all right? So,
That's right. That's right.
which is very clearly given in the scriptures. Leviticus mentions,
That's right.
Leviticus chapter 25 mentions, in extreme poverty, they might sell their liberty. And
That's
Exodus
right.
chapter 21 and verse 7 talks about a father may sell a daughter as a servant into a home with an intention
Yes.
that she would eventually marry into that family.
Family.
Here
That's right.
I would like to highlight one thing. Never a daughter is sold into prostitution, nor the law prescribed this action. This is
That's
one of
right.
the misconceptions people need to be cleared of.
That's right.
And the other case where people, the Hebrew became a slave is in case of a bankruptcy. A man might
That's
become
right.
a servant to his creditors. 2 Kings 4:1 says. And the last case is if a thief had nothing
That's
with
right.
which to pay proper restitution, then he becomes a slave, according to Exodus chapter 22 and verse 3. So
That's
in
right.
each of these cases, we see that the intent of becoming a servant to someone else was to be employed and thereby able to live rather than die, right?
Exactly. That's
Right?
right.
Right. And when we come to Exodus 21, because that is the chapter
Yes.
of our discussion, right?
That's
For this
right.
question, God
Yes.
is, as you mentioned, God is setting rules and regulations on how to treat servants, which
That's
actually
right.
takes away the right of a master to deal with them as he likes.
That's right.
Right. This in itself is an unbelievable precept in ancient culture where like there are
That's
no
right.
rights to slaves.
Yes.
And again, Exodus 21 and 2, we see that a servant was not bound forever to the master, right?
That's
But
right.
outmost for a
Yeah.
span of 6 years. So
6
he
years.
was not the master's property rather than an intended labor, right?
That's
For a
right.
limited
That's
period
right.
of time. So he could get
That's
out
right.
free in the
Yes.
7th year without paying
Correct.
anything, no matter how he became a slave in the first place.
First place. That's right.
Which is referred to the year of Jubilee, right? This
That's
kind
right.
of setting free of a slave was unheard of
Unheard of.
in the
That's
ancient
right.
times. So
That's true.
the rule of the time is that all slaves would rot and die at the master's mercy. But
That
here, the
is
God
right.
of the Torah, the God of Israel, gives these rules, and he
Liberates them in a way.
liberates them, and he brings a
Liberates them.
novel concept, very
Correct.
new or unique in the ancient Near East. So
That's true.
by limiting the time of slavery, if we can use the word slavery,
Correct.
which means someone can be a slave only for 6 years.
That's right. That's right. No one can be a slave more than that.
Right.
But then again, the author does not mention it. That's, I mean, the author's intent is only to bring about a point that is convenient to make her conclusions. So here the slave is only a slave for 6 years, and then he's free. He's free to go. So here in this particular context, she says that he cannot take his wife and children along with him. But then just, if you read the whole passage, we understand that if a slave came in as a married man, he already had a wife and family, then after 6 years, he could take them and go, because he was allowed to keep his family that he had prior to becoming a slave. He could take his family with him when he went. So that is not talked about by the author here. The specific context of this verse 3 and 4, is that the slave came in, if I could say, as a bachelor. He was not married. And the master provides a family for him. I mean, that itself is, an interesting concept. A slave is being provided with a family, a wife, and probably children. And if the master provided them, then the master had the right to keep them with them, because the master provided them to the slave, and the slave had to go. Now, the master cannot withhold anything from the slave that the slave had when he came. If he was married, his wife and children would go with him. But if he wasn't married, and then the master provided a family, then the master rightfully could keep them back. Yeah, fair enough, could keep them back. But again, we see here, the slave has an option. If he loves his family, if he wants to be with his family, if he wants to be with his master, then and only then he could continue being a servant in that household. If you have to stay more than 6 years and continue being a servant, then you could do, and then you could stay with your family. So here, it all depends on the slave, what he wanted to do. Do you want to stay, or do you want to go? Do you want to have a family, or you want to be set free? Again, this is a revolutionary concept, isn't it? The master has no right to determine what the slave does. The slave has the choice and the liberty to decide for himself. That again is so contrary to the very concept of slavery, if we understand slavery that was rampant there. Yes.
Yeah. So we can conclude by carefully reading the text that Bible in no way supports slavery, but in fact, it created laws for those who are often without rights, and God also graciously provided them a means of freedom through various laws and regulations, right?
That's right. So the Bible is in fact, very, the teachings of the Bible, or the laws in the Bible, are very crucial in eliminating slavery, not in establishing them. So that, that we need to keep in mind when we look through the slavery laws, that this was in fact a way of eliminating slavery and not establishing them.
Right. So there's a follow-up misconception to this with respect to slavery in Exodus 21:7, where the author mentions that God not only sanctions selling one's daughter into slavery, but he also gives out laws on how it should be done. I'll read Exodus chapter 27, verse 7 to 11. The author mentions, so that it will provide some clarity to the listeners. If a man sells his daughters to be a female slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do, if she does not please her master, who has betrothed her to himself. And he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt deceitfully with her. And if he has betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, her marriage rights. And if he does not do these three for her, then she shall go out free without money. That's what the text says, actually.
That's right. So this is just the follow-up text. So, the previous question, we dealt with verses 1 to 6 of 21. This is just attached to it, 7 to 11. So we first talked about a man being a slave. Here we talk about a woman being a slave. Now, look at the distinction here. A woman could not become a slave unless she was betrothed with a promise to be married. And, so see God's heart there. He's concerned about the well-being of this woman in this home. So she would ultimately become a family member. So she would be either betrothed to the master or the master's son, as this text implies. And then probably after a year, which was customary again for Jewish engagements, she would become the wife. Now, this context here is in case the master or his son did not take her to be wife after a certain period of time, then the word used is they have dealt deceitfully with her.
Yeah.
So God considers it as deceit because she was taken with a promise of being married as a betrothed woman, but now she's not being married. In this case, what can be done? The master cannot just send her off saying that you are just a slave. He cannot sell her to any foreigner, but he has to treat her with dignity, provide for her everything that he would provide to a wife.
Yeah.
And if the son was supposed to marry her, then she would now have the status of a daughter. It is clear in this text that you read the word custom of daughters. He should deal with her according to the custom of daughters. So now she has to be treated as a daughter. If not, she can be redeemed. She can be redeemed. If none of these options work out, that she's not treated with the dignity as a wife nor a daughter, and if she's not redeemed, only then she can be set free without having to pay any amount of money. Because when she became betrothed, this master would have paid a bride price to the father of this girl. But now when she goes, she need not pay him back. She can just be set free. Again, giving liberty to the slave. So either the choice would be a dignified life in the master's home, like a family member, though she's not married, or she can be redeemed or set free. So that is the context in which this text appears.
Right. It might be a little off topic, but I'm struck by one word that you used. Bride price that the master pays. It's actually the opposite of the bride price which happens now in our own culture.
That's
it's the girl who pays the price to the bridegroom in our culture.
That's right.
And oh boy, the consequences of that happening in our culture right now, unfortunately. But in those days, it was the master who paid the bride price and brought the girl in, right?
That's right.
So even in today's modern age of feminism, Shireen, and whatnot, how many men walk out on engagements unscared, not being held responsible in any way, let alone care for the women who was wronged. And our society just holds its peace. And can you imagine how countercultural and normal this was in ancient culture, what you just discussed about this being betrothed to the master or the master's son and being treated as one of the daughters of the house, if not redeemed, with dignity. And this tells that God cares for the slave women whose engagement was called off, elevating her dignity to that of a family member. Beautiful, isn't it?
That's beautiful, yes.
Yeah. So with this, we can wrap up our discussion on slavery in Torah, and with the underlying misconception that there is sexism in Torah. So we discussed about slavery, a male slave, a female slave, and what are the misconceptions the author has put. And I believe our explanation is sufficient to refute those claims. Then we will move on to the next section, where we will talk about polygamy. So this is a new section where we will be talking about Exodus chapter 21, and we would be dealing on this unknown author's statement on the evilbible.com in an article called Sexism in Torah, where she talks about a man taking several wives, and she says God ordains men taking several wives and even sets up laws to how multiple wives should be handled. Basically, she's talking about polygamy.
Yes, so in the Bible, if you see in the beginning of creation, when God made man and woman, God's original design, God's plan is one man and one woman in a covenantal relationship of marriage. God never ordained polygamy. He does not approve of polygamy. We see this in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18 to 25, where God made Adam and God made one Eve for Adam. If God wanted polygamy, he could have made many women and brought them to Adam one after the other. But God does not do that.
Absolutely. I'm glad he didn't do that.
Yes. So marriage in the Bible is one man and one woman in a covenantal union, in a covenantal relationship. And again, Jesus Christ in Matthew 19, even in the context of the disciples or the Pharisees asking him about divorce and remarriage, even there, he quotes back to the original creation account where he says, it was not so. In the beginning, God made one man and one woman. So that is very clear. God's plan for marriage is not polygamy, but it is a one man, one woman relationship. But of course, the cultures of that time, the ancient cultures, even we see this in kings of Israel and Judah, they had multiple wives. So the Israelites, the Hebrews, they definitely had their share of influence from the culture. And we see in most of the men in the Bible, they had multiple wives. But this does not mean that God approved or condoned their behavior. It does not mean that that was God's plan for the family. It is clear when we come to the end of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi, when the prophet Malachi accuses or brings out accusations against Israel, one chief accusation is that you have dealt treacherously with the wife of your covenant. No wives, but with the wife of your covenant. So there was one wife. It's one wife. So that's very clear both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. God never approved polygamy. And even these patriarchs or the people that we see who had multiple wives, they struggled because of it. There were family feuds, there were issues between children, issues between wives, and the effects of straying away from God's original design, we see clearly. When they did not keep the precepts of God and follow his design and took multiple wives, they absolutely suffered the consequences of it. So we even see that. So the God of the Bible in no way condones polygamy.
Yeah, I mean, polygamy never had a positive effect on families in the Bible then, right. And is the same case now, right? It's not a good idea.
That's true.
Think anybody should even consider it. Well, we have discussed many misconceptions, Shireen, all the way from the fall to polygamy right now. We have discussed the claims of this unknown author, where she calls the God of the Bible a sexist pig, and Torah being sexist against women, from the account of the fall to Lot's family to Judah's family, and topics regarding slavery and polygamy. However, as we discussed, all the arguments fell apart when we actually looked into the context and understood its original intent. And till now, we both have tried to provide meaning behind the text. But before we wrap up, let's see what some of the statistics say. Let's look at some facts and figures for those who love numbers and stats. If you look at societies generally built on Judeo-Christian principles, we see that women are enjoying elevated status and equal opportunities when compared to other faiths. It's no secret. I recently came across an interesting statistic from our own Indian government website. It's called vikaspedia.in. And there is a sub-page over which talks about overview of minority communities in India. So let me read some interesting mentions from there. According to this government website, under the overview of minority communities in India, socio-economic status of minorities was one of the heading, where it mentions the literacy rate among persons of age 15 and above was the highest for Christians for both sexes, male and female, including the educational levels, secondary and above, standing highest in all the minorities in India. Okay. Another a fact that's mentioned there is LFPR, which is the labor force participation rate. In the urban female category, it was the highest for Christian females. Let's look at another parameter, work participation rate. Male-female differential in this WPR, which is work participation rate, was the lowest among Christians, which means the Christian females are enjoying a better equality and support from their community to outshine others. So this makes us think, if Torah or the Bible is so sexist against its women, Why then the communities that adhere to Christian faith see this equality and progress among women? We have seen so many examples right around us. We can see examples if you're only willing to know the truth. So I want to remind the listeners of what Jesus said in John chapter 8, verse 32. Then you will know the truth, and truth will set you free. May the Spirit of truth guide us all into that all truth. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, and whoever believes in him will not die but have everlasting life. So, Shireen, it has been a wonderful time discussing with you these various topics, and I hope we both have provided enough of information and clarity to the listeners who would listen to this recording at a later point of time on understanding these misconceptions and clarifying them of the truths from the Bible. And it's our prayer that the truth would set them free. And so with this, goodbye till we meet again in another episode to discuss on the remaining misconceptions on sexism in Torah from the evilbible.com. So keep watching. Bye-bye.